Get out of my house. Out. Now. James Carter's voice cracked through the grand hallway like a whip. His eyes, bloodshot, wide, disbelieving, were fixed on the black woman sitting on the bed his late wife once died in. But what shattered the moment wasn't just his rage, it was the way his twin boys, Noah and Levi, curled beside her, sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks, their tear-streaked faces tucked into her arms like she was the only safe place left on earth. James stood frozen for a heartbeat, fists trembling. Then, in a sudden blur of fury, he raised his hand and struck her. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story already has your heart racing, subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales like this. Don't forget to hit that like button to support stories that matter. Back in the dim bedroom, silence fell like a stone. Lila Bennett didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't even flinch. She placed a hand gently over Noah's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. She turned her face slowly toward James, her cheek red and stinging, but her voice calm in a way that pierced deeper than any scream. They had night terrors, she said simply. One wet the bed. The other couldn't stop shaking. I didn't know where else to take them but here. I was just trying to keep them from breaking. James staggered backward. The fury was gone now, leaving only the raw edges of guilt and confusion. He looked at the floor, at his wife's photograph still hanging by the door, then back at Lila, this woman he'd barely known for a month, this housekeeper from the shelter downtown, who now held the only peace his children had known since the funeral. You're fired, he muttered. It was all he could manage. His voice, once steel, now sounded hollow. Lila didn't argue. She stood quietly, gently lifted Levi's hand off her shoulder, and pulled the covers higher over the boys' chests. Then, with slow, careful steps, she walked to the door. Her heels echoed down the marble hallway. But as she passed the stained-glass window at the landing, a memory broke loose in her chest, the sound of a child crying in the dark, not her own but her sister's, years ago, in a foster home that smelled like bleach and anger. That ache, the one she'd buried for decades, tightened behind her ribs as she stepped out into the misty Asheville night. Rain was falling, soft and steady, and the Blue Ridge Mountains loomed in the distance, indifferent to her pain. But Lila didn't crumble. Not this time. Her hand touched her face where James had hit her, but her mind clung to something else, the warmth of two small bodies finally at rest. The kind of peace she used to pray for when sleep was a stranger. Behind her, the boys remained still, breathing in unison. Thomas, the butler, stood at the corner of the hall. He had watched everything, heard everything, but said nothing. Only when Lila passed him did he murmur, "I'll make sure they're safe tonight, Miss Bennett." She nodded. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "Thank you." As the front door closed behind her, James sank into the edge of the bed, burying his head in his hands. He'd been holding grief like a sword, swinging it at anyone who came close. And now, he had struck the one person who hadn't backed away. The one who stayed when the boys screamed. Who whispered lullabies into their hair and held them through their nightmares. But James didn't know Lila's story, not yet. He didn't know she'd been abandoned at 12. That she'd survived 9 foster homes in 7 years. That she once had a daughter, born too early, buried too young. That every scar she carried had taught her how to cradle another's pain without flinching. He didn't know that the boys, in their quiet desperation, had found her not just comforting, but essential. She was a stranger by title, but something deeper had already rooted itself between them. The night swallowed her silhouette as she walked away, but inside her chest, something stirred, not bitterness, not defeat, but a strange, aching clarity. She knew what it meant to be discarded, misread, pushed aside. And she also knew she wouldn't stop loving those boys, even if it meant never seeing them again. Halfway down the driveway, her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas, They're asking for you." Both of them woke up crying. Lila closed her eyes, rain soaking through her jacket. She didn't turn back. Not yet. But she held the phone against her chest like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the mountains, an owl called. The world kept moving. And back in that grand house of grief and wealth, James Carter stared out the window, trying to make sense of a woman who had every reason to hate him, but had left without a single word of vengeance. He didn't know it yet, but the storm that began tonight wasn't just about anger. It was about healing. About confronting the past without hiding. About learning to parent through pain, and to love through the cracks. And for Lila, this was only the beginning. When Lila returned to the Carter estate 2 days later, it wasn't because she'd forgiven James Carter. It was because 2 6-year-old boys wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, and wouldn't sleep unless the woman who sang them lullabies was there. It was Thomas, the ever-composed butler, who drove to the River Arts District and waited outside the Carter-Bennett Center until Lila finished teaching an art therapy session. He handed her a sealed envelope, James's apology, or his best attempt at one. Inside was a single page, his handwriting rigid, uncertain. "I was wrong. I let grief become cruelty. If you can bear to return, for them, not me, I'd be grateful. No cameras. No conditions. Just your terms. James." It wasn't enough. It would never undo the slap. But Lila had learned long ago that healing never came from perfect words, it came from presence, from showing up, again and again, even when it hurt. That night, she walked back into the Carter mansion, not as a housekeeper, but as someone who now set the terms. Her first demand, take down every surveillance camera in the East Wing. Her second, family dinners, every night, no excuses. Her third, the twins would help create the house rules, so they could feel some sense of power in a world that had taken too much from them already. James agreed to them all, his pride swallowed in silence. He watched as Lila knelt beside Noah and Levi, who clung to her like driftwood in a storm. He didn't speak, not at first, but his eyes followed her everywhere, quietly studying how the boys began to laugh again, draw again, sleep through the night again. It unnerved him, how she brought calm without force, how her voice alone seemed to stitch broken hours together. Still, his guilt clung to him like smoke. Every time he passed her in the hall, he wanted to speak, but couldn't form the words. Lila didn't push. She simply moved through the house with quiet authority, placing a warm cup of cocoa on the twins' nightstand, leaving colored pencils by the window seat, folding their clothes with lavender sachets like her grandmother once did for her in the only home that ever felt safe. Meanwhile, across town, a new storm arrived in the form of Zoe Parker. 17 years old, flame-haired, eyes hard like glass. 7 foster homes in 18 months, and not a single placement lasted more than a few weeks. She'd been labeled unruly, impulsive, and a danger to herself and others, in every report. When she arrived at the Carter-Bennett Center, she didn't speak a word, just glared at Lila like she already knew she'd be disappointed. Lila, however, saw something familiar in her, the defiance, the armor, the desperate need not to care. On Zoe's second night, she tried to escape through the studio window. Lila found her perched on the fire escape, shivering in the Asheville mist. Instead of pulling her down, she sat beside her and said nothing. After several minutes, Zoe finally snapped, "Why do you even care? I'm just gonna leave like always." Lila's answer was simple. "Because I know what it's like to be left, and what it means when someone stays anyway." That silence, that small, shared stillness, became the first crack in Zoe's wall. The next morning, Lila handed her a blank canvas and said, "You don't have to talk. Just paint." What emerged was rage in color, jagged reds, tangled blacks, a fractured bird trying to break free. Lila didn't critique it. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for trusting the brush." Back at the estate, James began trying. Awkwardly, sometimes clumsily, but sincerely. He joined the boys for breakfast. He asked about their drawings. He even sat in on a bedtime story, though he stumbled over the rhymes and forgot how to do silly voices. But the effort mattered. Lila saw it in the boys' eyes, how they started to look at their father not with fear, but curiosity. One night, as she tucked them in, Levi whispered, "Is Daddy sad because Mommy died?" And Lila, heart tightening, replied, "Yes." And sometimes, when grown-ups are sad, they forget how to show love the right way. But he's learning. Levi nodded solemnly. Like how I used to hit Noah when I was mad. But now I say I'm sorry. Lila kissed his forehead. Exactly like that. It was then that she realized healing didn't have to be grand, it could be as small as a child understanding that even pain can be unlearned. But just as the house began to feel like something close to whole, the first shadow returned. James found a letter on his office desk, slipped under the door. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His late wife's parents, Richard and Patricia Langston, had hired an attorney. They intended to sue for full custody of the boys, citing emotional instability and inappropriate caretaking arrangements, a veiled reference to Lila. James's hands trembled as he read it. Not just because of the threat, but because deep down, he knew they would stop at nothing to erase Lila from the boys' lives. He walked down the hall, letter in hand, and found her in the sunroom, guiding the twins through a finger-painting session. Light poured through the glass. Color swirled across the canvas. For a moment, it looked like peace. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her laughter coax a smile from Noah. And in that instant, James understood the depth of what he was about to lose. Lila looked up and met his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, something raw and real. She knew. He didn't have to say it. The storm was coming. But this time, she wouldn't be walking away. And neither would he. The storm came faster than anyone expected. Within a week, Richard and Patricia Langston, James's in-laws and the boys' maternal grandparents, filed for emergency custody of Noah and Levi. Their legal team moved swiftly, leveraging their family name, connections, and a cold arsenal of courtroom tactics. The headline in the Asheville Gazette read, "Wealthy philanthropists fight for custody of grandsons from controversial center run by ex-foster child." The smear campaign was brutal. The article highlighted Lila Bennett's history in the foster system, insinuated that she was unfit to work with children, let alone care for them, and falsely claimed she had once been institutionalized, twisting her past therapy records into something shameful. They referred to the Carter-Bennett Center as a radical experiment run by a self-proclaimed healer with no formal degree in child psychology. Overnight, donors began to pull their support. Scheduled partnerships froze. Staff whispered in corners, uncertainty bleeding through every hallway. Zoe, who had just begun to trust the place, was the first to feel the shift. "They're going to shut us down, aren't they?" she asked, voice low as she watched Lila pack away art supplies in the studio. Lila paused, held the girl's gaze, and replied, "Only if we let them." But even her voice, usually steady as stone, trembled at the edges. What hurt more wasn't the press or the petition, it was the betrayal from within. One of their own, a recently hired assistant named Claire, had leaked falsified intake documents to the Langstons' lawyers, documents that made it appear as if Zoe had been taken in without proper state approval. The damage was immediate. Social Services launched an investigation. And for the first time since opening its doors, the center faced the threat of closure. James was livid. He fired Claire the moment the truth came out, but the stain was already there. He met with lawyers, PR teams, anyone who might help clean up the mess. But the more he tried to fix things with money, the clearer it became, this wasn't about dollars. This was personal. The Langstons wanted to reclaim their image, rewrite their daughter's legacy, and erase every trace of Lila from their grandsons' lives. They saw her as an intruder. A stranger with no pedigree, no blood ties, no right to belong. And Lila felt it like a blade to the chest, not just the attack, but the implication that her love wasn't real because it wasn't biological. Amid the chaos, another ghost from Lila's past surfaced, her mother, Marlene. She showed up unannounced at the center's front door, looking thinner, older, but still carrying that same restless energy Lila remembered from childhood. "You always said I left you," Marlene said. "But I was drowning. I didn't know how to be a mother when I'd never been mothered myself." Lila stood frozen, emotions warring beneath her skin, rage, grief, and that old, aching need for answers. "You disappeared," she said, her voice low. "You left me in that shelter and never came back. I had to raise myself." Marlene's eyes welled. "I know. And I hate myself for it every day. But I heard about the center, and I wanted to see what you built. I wanted to see if I could still be part of your life." Lila didn't know how to respond. She wanted to scream. She wanted to collapse into her mother's arms. Instead, she just turned and walked into the nearest studio, leaving Marlene standing alone in the hallway, hands shaking. That night, as rain lashed against the windows of the Carter estate, Zoe vanished. Her room was empty. Her backpack gone. Panic spread like wildfire. Lila and James searched the surrounding streets, the train station, the alleys near the riverfront. Hours passed. Finally, near dawn, they found her in the abandoned greenhouse behind the center, curled beneath a blanket of plastic tarp, sobbing. "I thought if I left, maybe they'd stop attacking you," she whispered. "I ruin everything." Lila crouched beside her, heart splitting. "You don't ruin anything. You survived what most people couldn't. That doesn't make you a problem. That makes you a miracle." Zoe didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. She let Lila wrap her in a blanket and guide her home. It was a turning point. Lila realized then that no matter what the court said, she would not give up on the family she'd chosen. Not for money, not for status, not even for safety. The next morning, she and James began preparing for court. Not with polished lawyers and strategy memos, but with truth. Lila wrote her own testimony by hand, 10 pages that told the story no one else could tell. She wrote about the boys, how they whispered their mother's name in their sleep, how Levi once painted a picture of her crying stars into a river. She wrote about Zoe, about what it meant to see herself in someone else's fire. And she wrote about herself, about growing up in 9 different homes, about being told she'd never amount to anything, about how it took years to believe she deserved to love or be loved. James worked beside her in silence. Not controlling, not directing, but supporting, finally understanding that the most powerful thing he could offer wasn't his money, but his willingness to stand behind Lila without needing the spotlight. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones swarmed. The Langstons arrived in a black SUV, dressed in polished grief and artificial righteousness. Lila wore a soft blue dress and no makeup. Zoe walked beside her, chin high. James followed with the twins, both holding hand-drawn signs, "We want Lila." Inside the courtroom, the tension crackled. The Langstons' attorney painted James as unstable and Lila as unqualified. They showed the photo of the night James struck Lila. They twisted the narrative, framing it as evidence of violence and neglect. But when it was Lila's turn, the room fell silent. She stepped to the stand, her voice steady but full of gravel. She spoke of pain, yes, but also of hope. She described the first time Noah let her hold his hand. The way Levi stopped stuttering after a month of bedtime stories. She spoke of Zoe's first painting, and how art became the language they all used to heal. "I may not share their blood," she said, "but I've earned their trust. And that's something no court order can fabricate." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't perform. She just told the truth. And sometimes, that's all it takes to shift a room. When the judge called for recess, even the stenographer had tears in her eyes. Outside, the skies threatened rain again, but Lila stood in the courthouse garden, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from something close to resolve. She wasn't just fighting for the children. She was fighting for her right to exist in a space that had tried so long to shut her out. A space called family. When the judge returned to the bench after recess, the air inside the courtroom was thick with expectation, like the pause before thunder. James sat with his head bowed, one arm wrapped protectively around the twins. Zoe clutched a folded sheet of paper in her lap, her jaw tight, her fingers trembling. Lila stood at the front, spine straight, eyes steady, though her knees felt like they might buckle at any moment. The Langstons looked polished as ever, seated like royalty behind their lawyer, their expressions unreadable but their intention unmistakable. They wanted the past rewritten in their favor, and they didn't care who got erased in the process. But then came the moment no one saw coming. "Your Honor," the judge began, her voice calm but firm, "this case is not just about legal custody. It is about moral responsibility. And what I have seen today, from both parties, speaks volumes about what these children truly need." A breath caught in James's throat. The judge continued, "I see no evidence of endangerment under Mr. Carter's care. And Ms. Bennett," she turned to Lila, "your testimony was not only honest, but courageous. It is the opinion of this court that the petition for emergency custody is denied." A gasp rippled through the room. Lila's heart stopped, then surged as if her soul exhaled. The Langstons' lawyer stood in protest, but the judge shut it down with a single raised hand. "Furthermore," she added, "this court acknowledges the Carter-Bennett Center's significance to the community and will not allow unsubstantiated allegations to undermine its mission." The courtroom burst into quiet applause before being hushed by the bailiff. The Langstons stood, stunned, as if they'd never imagined a world where their money couldn't buy the ending. Patricia glared at Lila with a fury born of entitlement, but Richard simply looked down, ashamed, or perhaps finally aware of what they had tried to destroy. James reached for Lila's hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. It was over. At least, the legal part. But outside those courthouse walls, another battle still burned, one of reputation, public perception, and survival. That's when Zoe, the girl who once refused to speak to anyone, did something no one expected. At a press conference held on the center's mural-covered steps, surrounded by reporters and critics, she stepped forward and asked to speak. The crowd quieted. Cameras turned. And she unfolded that same crumpled paper from the courtroom. Her voice was shaky at first. "I've been in 7 foster homes in 18 months. Some were okay. Most weren't. People looked at me like I was trouble, like I was broken before I even opened my mouth. But at the Carter-Bennett Center, I wasn't just a case file. I was seen. I was heard." Her words gained strength, like a match catching wind. "Ms. Lila taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means making something beautiful from what was shattered." She held up a photo of her mural, a giant bird with fractured wings, painted in gold leaf, flying over a field of cracked pottery. "This is my story. And stories like mine matter. We matter." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "If you want to shut this place down, you're not just hurting us, you're silencing kids who never had a voice to begin with." The speech went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 2 million times. Donations poured in. Supporters rallied around the center. Celebrities tweeted their praise. A major news outlet even requested to feature Zoe in a documentary about youth resilience. For the first time in her life, Zoe felt like the world wasn't just watching her fall, it was finally watching her rise. And Lila? She wept, not from sadness, but from awe. She'd built this space for kids like Zoe, but in that moment, it was Zoe who was carrying them all forward. Days later, a new chapter began. Marlene, Lila's mother, returned, not to beg, but to listen. They sat on a park bench beneath a wide oak tree in Asheville's Pack Square, watching children chase bubbles across the grass. Marlene confessed the parts of her life Lila never knew, how she had been abused by her own mother, how fear and shame had paralyzed her, how leaving Lila had broken her in ways she still couldn't name. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, voice thick. "But I want to try. I want to show up now, even if it's late." Lila sat silently, hands clenched in her lap. "You weren't just late," she said slowly. "You were gone. For years." Marlene nodded. "I know. But I see you now. And I see what you've built. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of it." There was no dramatic embrace. No swelling music. Just a quiet moment between two women scarred by the same cycle, choosing, tentatively, not to repeat it. Back at the Carter estate, James was preparing something of his own. He called Lila into the study, a place she rarely entered. On the desk were blueprints. 3 new locations, he said. Charlotte. Raleigh. Atlanta. The Carter-Bennett model is working. People believe in it now. And I want you to lead it, with me. As co-director. And he hesitated. As their legal co-guardian. Lila blinked. "You mean the boys?" "Yes," James said. "I want you to have rights, not just responsibilities. You already love them like your own. This just makes it official." Lila looked at the documents, her heart racing. For years, she'd been the one left behind. The one never chosen. And now she was being asked to be permanent. Before she could answer, a knock interrupted them. It was a courier, dropping off an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single sentence, typed in bold, "She's not who you think." Beneath it was an old photo, Lila as a teenager, standing next to a man she hadn't seen in decades. Her father. Daniel. A name she hadn't spoken aloud since she was 12. The note was unsigned, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to sow doubt again, just as things were healing. James looked at her, concerned. "Is everything okay?" Lila nodded slowly, folding the paper and slipping it into her pocket. "Yes," she said. "It's nothing I can't handle." But her hands trembled, and her breath came shorter than usual. Someone didn't want her to feel safe. Someone didn't want her to stay. But Lila had weathered worse. She would weather this too. Because she had children to protect, a center to grow, and a life she wasn't willing to give up, not now, not ever. That night, as the center hosted a candlelit event honoring foster youth, Lila stood on stage beside Zoe and the twins. The bird mural loomed behind them, golden and defiant. James watched from the wings, eyes shining. And in that glow of flickering lights and gentle music, surrounded by survivors and dreamers, Lila realized something. The fire that once burned to destroy her had become the fire that lit her way. She had stepped into the storm, and come out shining. The morning sunlight filtered through the oak trees of Asheville like golden threads woven into the earth, casting dappled light on the Carter-Bennett Center's new courtyard garden, where laughter danced through the air like wind chimes. It was the grand opening of the Hall of Resilience, a dream born from fire and forged in love, a gallery space filled with artwork, letters, and stories from children who had survived the worst and still chosen to bloom. In the center stood Zoe's mural, now complete, a fractured bird with wings outstretched, flying above a field of golden painted stones, each one engraved with a word: hope, courage, home. Lila stood at the entrance, wearing a flowing cream blouse and slate-gray pants, her hair pulled back in a soft bun, eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to celebrate this new beginning. Around her bustled volunteers, staff, and youth from across North Carolina. Marlene stood to the side, helping hand out commemorative pins to guests. She'd come a long way from their first cold reunion, slowly rebuilding trust one shared moment at a time. Lila had kept her boundaries, but allowed the possibility of something more than estrangement. Healing, she had learned, didn't mean pretending nothing happened. It meant planting new roots in old soil. James approached from behind, dressed in a simple navy button-down and khakis, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You've built something beautiful," he said, passing her a cup. Lila smiled faintly. "We built it." Their eyes lingered, the unspoken history between them stretching back through sleepless nights, courtroom wars, and soft moments where love had slowly replaced duty. "Are you nervous about tonight?" he asked. Lila took a sip. "A little. It's not every day a former foster kid opens a keynote at a national trauma-informed care conference." James smirked. "That former foster kid has already changed lives. This is just the next ripple." Lila looked over at Zoe, who stood near the stage in a deep green dress, talking to a younger girl who clung to her every word. Zoe had grown in ways no one could have predicted, stronger, calmer, with her spark still intact but her heart more open. She had been chosen to speak alongside Lila at the conference, her speech titled, "Scars Are Maps, Not Warnings." Lila had cried the first time she read it. The center was expanding, plans had been approved for 3 new branches, all modeled after the original. Local officials now consulted Lila on best practices. Former skeptics had become donors. And every wall in the new wing carried the fingerprints of kids who once believed they were invisible. But even in all this growth, Lila remained grounded. That morning, a man had come by the center. Older. Tired. Wearing a frayed jacket and holding a worn photo of a girl at a bus stop. "Her name was Lila," he said. "I was her father." And just like that, the air had gone still. Lila had met him in the courtyard. Daniel. A name that once meant protection but eventually came to mean silence. He apologized, as so many do when the past finally catches up. He said he was afraid, ashamed, that life had swallowed him whole. He asked if she might one day forgive him. Lila had listened. And when he finished, she looked him in the eye and said, "I don't need an apology to let go. But I won't invite you into my life just because we share blood. I have a family now, one I chose, and one that chose me." He'd nodded quietly and walked away, no bitterness, just understanding. That, too, was healing. That, too, was strength. As the afternoon sun warmed the garden, Noah and Levi ran toward her, each holding something small in their hands. "We made you a gift." Levi beamed, opening his fist to reveal a smooth river rock, painted gold, with the word MOM scratched in the center. Noah's matched, but his said, "Safe." Tears prickled behind Lila's eyes as she knelt to hug them, her arms wrapped around their tiny shoulders. "You boys know I'm not trying to replace your mom, right?" she whispered. Noah nodded. "We know. But you're the one who stayed." Behind them, James stood silently, watching, something soft unfolding in his chest. Later that evening, after the crowd had gone and the sun dipped behind the mountains, James walked with Lila to the greenhouse they had restored together. The air was thick with jasmine and soil, and the stars had begun to prick through the sky. Without preamble, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple velvet box. No fanfare. No spotlight. Just quiet sincerity. "This isn't about starting something perfect," he said, voice low. "It's about building something real. Will you marry me?" Lila stared at him, heart racing. She thought of the girl she once was, abandoned, voiceless, unseen. And then she thought of the woman she had become, rooted, open, no longer defined by what was broken but by what had been rebuilt. "Yes," she said. "But only if we keep doing the work, together." James nodded. "Always." That night, under the ancient oaks, the twins, Zoe, Lila, and James planted a rose sapling in the center garden. They dug with their hands, laughing as dirt smudged their clothes, the twins arguing over where exactly to place the roots. Zoe placed her bird mural stone at the base. For flight, she said. James added a photograph of his late wife and whispered, for memory. Lila pressed her palms into the soil and whispered, for grace. And as they stood there, 5 people once fractured by pain now stitched together by choice, the wind swept through the trees, carrying the scent of blossoms and the promise of all that could still grow. The rose trembled in the breeze, not from weakness, but from being alive. Rooted, yes. But also reaching. Reaching for something more. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and share. Tell us your favorite moment in the comments.